So our last talk this evening is from Professor Mike Edmunds from Cardiff University, and the title is Christmas is Past, the Best Popular Astronomy Books Ever. Mike.
H.G. Wells, at the end of the 19th century, wrote a short article in Nature. It starts off, popular science is to be feared, is a phase that conveys a certain flavour of contempt to many a scientific worker. Now, that persistence that we shouldn't really talk to the public about what we do, because they won't understand it, persisted, I think, for many years, and it's only perhaps fairly recently been completely reversed, I think. But he noted even at that time that this was a source of grave regret to all specialists with literary leanings and with the welfare of science at heart. Again, a plea for the public understanding of science. And I think all of us would agree, best popular astronomy books must be something that is doing something to educate, to entertain, and to bring astronomy to non-specialists. So what am I going to look at if I'm going to talk about best popular and astronomy books? Well, astronomy books is okay. It's the best and popular that may be the problem. Popular. How are we going to measure popular? Am I going to do it from the number of copies? Turns out it's incredibly difficult to actually get any real quantitative data on numbers of books published. Very, very difficult. So you have to sort of do some approximation. Number of editions is often a good way of noting a book that's been successful, going through a lot of editions. But then what do you normalise that to? I mean, if we're talking about popular books recently or popular books in the 19th century, do we normalise it to the population? Do we normalise it to the literate population? Well, you can see the problem. So we're going to be not too particular about our statistics. To a large extent, this is bound to be a personal choice, as is inevitable. And I've also made a decision not to include any book by a living author. This was purely for reasons of personal safety. So what makes a good popular book? Why are some books extremely popular and some last and others don't? I have dreadful memories of years ago going into bookshops and seeing rows and rows of science tomes from the 1930s and sort of resolved never to write one because that was what was going to happen to it. But some books survive and are extremely popular. Most science books, though, are not literary. That's the first thing you rapidly... There are very few textbooks that are really literary. Science itself is really, not always, sometimes there are some very good science books that are literary, but of itself, science isn't really a literary genre. One thing that you're going to notice in all of these books is they rely on grand themes. They're not afraid to go boldly. And undoubtedly one that's important, you don't need to tell, is it obvious, stylish, clear writing is important. And also that the vocabulary they use is appropriate to the audience that reads them. Doesn't mean talking down, but that you can actually understand what the hell's going on in reading the book. Okay, so what do we mean by the most popular as well? Well, let's start with the one that really precipitated this talk. The death of Stephen Hawking earlier this year is really what stimulated this talk. To think, well, he wrote one book, The Brief Story of Time, Brief History of Time, which was extraordinarily successful. And one might want to ask, why was it so successful? It went into many editions, many editions around the world. It was translated into many languages. Some examples here. And let's just look at some of the statistics of it. It was published in 1988, so that's 30 years ago. Got my maths right. Just check. It was on the Sunday Times bestseller list for 237 weeks. Its total sales were greater than 9 million. Now, what do you compare that with? Lord of the Rings has sold a lot more copies than that, if you're interested. I think it's 50 or 60 million, something like that, getting up around that way. But undoubtedly for a science book, 9 million is an extraordinary amount. There's been discussion, I think I have heard him, or certainly I think Simon Minton discussing the fact there's only one equation in the book, E equals mc squared, and this was wise. Okay, there was an empirical rule that if you put, for every equation you put in, you halve your readership. One could argue, I suppose, that to some extent there was how do you fold in the inspiration of his disability? What did this have to do with the sales of the book? Well, I think there was something in that. The fact that somebody in his condition was prepared and was able even to address these problems and to write about them meant that it was something that was very important, and therefore I'm sure people took that on as that if he's prepared to do this, I'm prepared to do this because it must be important. Also, of course, it's a broad subject, and I think the appeal of the idea that it's a brief history of time must have also been very attractive in the book. However, there has been some unkindness in that it led to the definition of the Hawking function, where f of n is the number of people who've read beyond page n in the book. And it was rumoured that this is the only function that goes to 0 faster than the exponential, but I think that's very unfair. But it highlights a certain phenomena that people sometimes like a book to have it on their shelves, necessarily haven't read it. Right, that's number one on the list we're going to look at. I'm going to give you our most popular, and I don't think you'll anticipate what the most popular science book of all time is going to be, or most popular astronomy book is going to be, but there we are. Another one you could go for is Cosmos. Most of you will have heard of this one. It was written in 1980 by Carl Sagan. It rose out of a very popular TV series, 500 million viewers worldwide. The book sale of the book was more than 5 million. And it's a story of cosmic evolution, science, and civilization. Again, quite a broad theme. Okay, again, this, if you want to write something, make it broad if you can. And it's still in print. Buy it quite happily today. So again, a good candidate for an extremely popular, good astronomy, general astronomy, and other things in there. There's biology in there, there's geology, etc., etc. First editions go for quite a good price if you happen to have one. That's a signed one, which went recently for $3,000 odd. However, there is a little danger of being a writer of a popular book that you may become too deified. There is a danger. Right, now I start getting a little bit more controversial. What's my next favourite? One that I would reckon is one of the most popular. I'll go for this one, The Sleepwalkers. How many people have read The Sleepwalkers? Excellent. Now, this is interesting. It was published in 1959 by a guy called Arthur Koestler, who was quite a polemic writer. You have to ignore some bits, sort of rather political bits in a bit of the book. He admits it's a personal and speculative account of a controversial subject. Really, it's supposed to be all about, I'll show the title page in a minute, but it's really about Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. And it's told extraordinarily well. Here's the title page, A History of Man's Changing Vision of the Universe. Well, it's really only about the years around Kepler, Galileo, and so on. However, I say it was very important, very popular, very enjoyable, but there is a health warning with this book. I'll just give you a couple of passages from the review, a review that was published at the time it was published by, and I won't mention them, but two very distinguished historians of science. His thesis is to show modern science is the work of antisocial schemers, cowards, liars, hypocrites, irresponsible cranks, or contemptuous snobs. You'll recognise yourselves, no doubt, in this. It would be a waste of time even to list here, let alone rectify the source cause of errors and misrepresentations. The treatment of Galileo is simply dishonest from beginning to end. I don't think they liked it. And it's interesting. It shows that the book doesn't necessarily have to be completely correct, because undoubtedly Koestler did play fast and loose with the historical record. But he wrote a bloody good book that was really enjoyable. And again, went into many editions and translations. So, and can I just take it? Those of you who read it, would you say you enjoyed it? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Still worth reading too. Okay. Next one, Frontiers of Astronomy. The older generation, in fact, the very older generation in the room, will remember this book fondly, I think. It was published in 1955, written by Fred Hoyle, who had got a lot of radio experience in the early 1950s. And this book, with a sort of summary of Frontiers of Astronomy, was, there are quotes saying it's one of the greatest popular science books ever written, not just astronomy, popular science books ever written, and undoubtedly inspired a whole generation of astronomers into astronomy. It's very good on stars, however, not so good on the steady state, or at least the veracity. There's a lot wrong in this book now, but I was looking at a review recently, the recent review saying it's still well worth reading, just for the good bits, if you like to put it that way. Again, went into many editions, particularly it was popular in America, which is unusual perhaps for an English science writer. I think that has to go on the list. This is what he starts it as. Man's claims to have progressed far beyond his fellow animals must be supported not by his search for food, warmth, and shelter, however ingeniously conducted, but by his penetration into the very fabric of the universe. Big scheme again, okay. I'll just show you one particular little review of it from The Spectator. One of the most remarkable books in the story of modern science. For its significance, in the progress of thought, it must be ranked with, say, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. I'm sure Fred would have agreed, but I think in retrospect, you can overclaim for some of these books. He wrote some other great stuff as well, and I won't go into that, but his science fiction and also his television drama that he wrote in the 50s and 60s are still well worth reading. Now, I'm going to mention two books which could go on the list, but I'm not going to put them on the list because I don't think they really do our criteria. They're well known at the time. James Jeans's The Mysterious Universe from 1930 and Arthur Eddington's Expanding Universe from 1933. Good books, but not as popular as what I'm really looking for. My next one, we go back a bit further. We're going back to the end of the 19th century, 1855, and a book called A Popular History of Astronomy During the 19th Century, written by Agnes Mary Clark, of whom the Society has a medal in her honour, you may remember nowadays. What's interesting about this book, it's quite scientific. It really introduces spectroscopy. She was a friend of the Hugginses, who you know were the pioneers of astronomical spectroscopy. It was published in the USA, translated into German, went through 4 editions up to about 1902. Very well written. And again, the first line, the progress of astronomy during the last 100 years has been rapid and extraordinary. So it's about 19th century astronomy and all the sort of astrophysics that was coming into play, really. A book you may not have heard of, but it's interesting that it was so popular and was one of the first books to use photographs. And again, a reason to make it popular. And again, something you might indeed like to have had for Christmas around the turn of the century. And I'll put that on the list. Going back slightly, we'll just take a literary waypoint at the moment. Middlemarch, 1871, George Eliot. I believe it was Stephen Hawking's Desert Island Disc book, actually. So just a couple of quotes from it that you may not know. A little moon that would cause hardly a calculable perturbation. She's using a metaphor. And another one, hardly less complicated than the revolutions of an irregular solid. These are fairly subtle points of science for a general readership, and shows that, in fact, interest in science at that time was very high, and indeed the literary level the literacy level of science was pretty high. Back past 1859, casting a sideways glance at one of the best, and this would go if we were doing biology, of course, The Origin of Species, which was, to some extent, written for a popular audience as much as a scientific one, and, as you know, was reasonably successful. So we'll go back to 1834. And a book called On the Connection of the Physical Sciences, connecting together sciences, written by Mary Somerville, again a name many of you will know. It went through 10 editions between 1838 and 1877. It sold over 15,000 copies, which for a science book at that time is good. One of the strengths of it is each edition was heavily revised as more progress was made, and it grew and grew and grew. It's published in France, Italy, Germany, the USA, and ended up over 500 pages of astronomy, physics, chemistry, geography, meteorology, etc. So it was quite a big work, quite a compendium. Again, quite popular, and I think that also has to go on the popularity list. Okay, now, no equations again. She was wise, no equations, though she was an able mathematician. There's some geometry in the appendix, if you want to get that far. And I'm told it was apparently inspired John Crouch Adams, the sort of predictor of Neptune, into astronomy, if you want additional recommendation for it. Okay. And you can still get a copy of it in print through Cambridge. Right. Back further now to somebody I hope you will recognise. Sidereus Nuncius. Now, I hope most of you have read this one. If you haven't, you should. Sidereus Nuncius is almost a preprint. Galileo invented, pinched, got hold of, whatever, his telescope and turned it on the heavens. 1610, Venice. He realises he's seeing fantastic new things. The first time a telescope's really been really seriously used for looking at the sky. Within 8 weeks, he's published a book on what he's seen. Within 8 weeks. And of the 450 copies, at least 83 of the originals still survive, which is remarkable in itself. In fact, if you're interested in the history of the book, there's a nice book was published a couple of years ago in 2001 about how Galileo actually got the thing published in 8 weeks. Here's the book. There's the original title page. To some extent, it was addressed to the Medicis. It was a sort of job application, CV. What a CV to present, to get himself some money from the Medicis. Still in press. This is the one you can easily pick up on Amazon. Please do. It was wonderful. He did the first diagram showing mountains on the moon and craters. They're quite difficult these days to make out exactly what he saw. Here's the Pleiades. Can you see the 5 stars? And all the other stars he saw in the Pleiades. And here, the best bit of all is where this is in Latin, of course. The modern ones are in translation. You'll be relieved to hear. Where he actually looks at Jupiter from night to night and sees for the first time, sees the little moons moving from night to night, and the solar system in miniature. This is live, real astronomy. This has to go on the list. So, how about Mr. Copernicus? De Revolutionibus, rather. Now, this is a book that is certainly not going to go on my list of most popular. Very important, brilliant book. But as Owen Gingerich did a wonderful book calling about On the Book That Nobody Read. Because it was, I think it's Koestler, in fact, who described it as a book nobody read. And to some extent it's true, although Gingerich traced all the copies that existed of the original book and showed that it, in fact, was read, but not read widely by the intelligentsia, read by astronomers and so on. And it really, what Copernicus should have done is publish his Commentarolius, I can never pronounce this Commentarolius book, which was a sort of preprint he wrote in longhand around 1512 to 1514 and circulated privately. There are about 80 copies, I think, in all. And that's much shorter and tells all you want to know about Copernicus in the Copernican system in a very short way. But it was never published, unfortunately. But that would have gone on the list had he published it. Okay, so before I announce the winner of the most popular astronomy book, I'm going to go back to ancient Greece for my next choice. And that is a book by Aratus called The Phenomenon. And for the benefit of those with a classical education, I've written it down here. For the mathematicians, you can work it out anyway. Phenomena. From the Greek. It's always fun to suddenly recognize these words. What the Greek word means is things that appear, and it's about the appearance of the heavens, basically. Now, the book was written around 280 to 260 BC, okay, around 260, 70 years BC by a guy called Aratus. Aratus came from Sully in Cilicia. I'll show a map of where that is. Those are his dates. He based it on a previous phenomenon by the astronomer Eudoxus, and also a book on weather law by a guy called Theophrastus. Okay, and if you're interested, just so you can, that's where Aratus lives. There's Cyprus, there's Greece. Here's the nasty bits at the moment. Here's Aratus here, Eudoxus here, Theophrastus there. That's the sort of area that this book came from. It's in Greek verse. That's the point. Aratus was a poet, not a scientist. And he wrote this book in Greek verse. So you read it as Greek verse. So it's a literary composition, but with its astronomy pretty much right. There were various other translations. Latin translation, particularly the well-known one, is by Cicero, the great Latin orator. Okay, what is it? Well, it identifies the constellations, describes them, talks about risings and settings of constellations and so on in the sky, talks about circles on the sphere, the tropics, the equinoxes, the tropics and equator and ecliptic and so on, and also talks about weather signs. Okay. Now, this book lasted a long time, had a long influence. If I just get forward again to 1515 AD, Dürer was involved in the first printed star map. This is a copy of the first printed star map. And you'll notice there are 4 astronomers around the map. And if we go up here, there he is, Aratus. Okay, so still in Dürer's time, 1500s, Aratus was a well-known name, and this book had existed right through the Middle Ages as a popular source of astronomical knowledge. And just a couple of quotes from it. But when in autumn frequent swarms of wasps crowd on every side, one can foretell the winter storms to come even before the Pleiades are westering. So, either do it from the wasp or the fact where you see the Pleiades in the sky, you'll know winter's coming. Useful information. And my favourite too is this one, though, from the phenomenon. But if the sun plunges cloudless into the western water and the clouds standing near him are red while he's setting and after he's gone, there's no need for you to be afraid of rain tomorrow. Not when reddish clouds appear here and there when the sun delays his appearance before dawn, do the fields go unwatered that day. A red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Right back to the days of Aratus. Following, really, the verses were following on Hesiod's Works and Days, really, which is a poem of the classical era. Okay. And the winner of the most popular science ever book is, I hope you recognise it, Sacrobosco's De Sphera. Now, this is surprising because I don't hear a cheer at this introduction. However, I'll make the case for it, okay? Sacrobosco wrote this in Paris around 1230 AD, okay? His name was John of Sacrobosco. He was probably born in England and died in France, probably. You can see the dates there, 1195 to 1236-ish. There were other, De Sphera cross means about spheres, okay? It's really the celestial sphere. There are others De Sphera. There's a guy called Grosseteste in England who wrote another De Sphera. There are various of them. Now, before you get too intimidated, I will point out that Sacrobosco just means holy wood, or Hollywood, okay? And Grosseteste just means big head. So don't get too intimidated by the thing. De Sphera was only about 9,000 words long. It quotes from Virgil and Ovid, so it has some literary pretensions too. The earliest known manuscript sort of it is known from 1240, so that's not long after it was written. It's a very similar sort of book to the Aratus that I was talking about, the phenomenon. It shows the general structure of the universe, circle on spheres, daily rotation of the heavens, rising and setting of signs, and said a bit about the motion of the planets and eclipses. There's some of the examples from a French manuscript copy, fairly early French manuscript copy. This is the sort of geocentric system. This is showing eclipses. This is showing the light on the moon and so on. To continue, though, manuscripts copies from 1240. It was the first astronomy book to be printed. It was printed in Ferrara for the first time in 1472. Now then, from 1472 to Antwerp in 1673, there are 200 editions in print. Okay? So in other words, it's been in press for 200 years, and that's 430 years for the last printed edition after it was written. Now, I don't believe, well, I don't know, but I'd be surprised if A Brief History of Time is still in print in 200 years' time. The reason this was so popular is it began to form part of the liberal arts education of everybody in Europe. Liberal arts, this is what you were supposed to know about astronomy. So an awful lot of people would read this because it's what they knew about astronomy. It was in Latin, but from 1500 onwards it was translated into other languages, often with many additions about more modern astronomy and so on. So that's my suggestion as the most popular astronomy book ever, in print for a long time, read by all the intelligentsia, essentially, all over Europe. And also, the later editions had things like these little cardboard cutouts and things to play with. Always a good thing if you want to sell books. Okay, so to finish, here's the short list. I've written them out here. That's my winner. But the ones with stars on are people who were not primarily astronomers, but were primarily writers. And it's about half and half from professional astronomers, half and half writers. So I'll finish there, but I'll leave you with this quote. This is from Cicero, from Scipio's Dream. If one had ascended to heaven and had obtained a full view of the nature of the universe and the beauty of stars, just as George was telling us we've almost done now, yet his admiration would be without delight if there were no one to whom he could tell what he had seen. Surely that's what we're trying to do in these popular books. Merry Christmas.
Well, Mike, I think we've time for just one question at the back there. Please wait for the microphone.
I hope I can be so brief there can be another. Two suggested additions, Bronowski's Ascent of Man and Eddington's Nature of the Physical World.
Very good. John Barrow, perhaps, fitting.
I believe the biggest selling popular astronomy book of, certainly of modern times, probably of all times, sold over 28 million copies between 1973 and 1990. It was published by Bantam, the same publisher as Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, and it was The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Oh. One of these sort of creationist astronomy. So it totally dwarfs everything else in the popular science world. It's amazing.
Huh. Okay, well, that's not good news, is it? Mike, thank you very much. Can I announce that the next open meeting will take place on January the 11th, 2019. Can I wish you all a very pleasant and happy Christmas holiday, and I look forward, like all of you will, to a copy of Sacrobosco's De Sfera in your Christmas stocking. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.